When I was a kid, my favorite thing to talk about was space. I owned dozens of books about space. I loved sci-fi and Doctor Who and Ben 10. I even wanted to be an astronaut when I grew up. And, close. I once jumped really high. I don't know, I just really got up there. But as obsessed with the vast, boundless abyss of our universe as I was, one of the best parts about that obsession was that I wasn't alone in having it. Space was like every kid's obsession growing up. In fact, there are two types of children. There are space kids and there's dinosaur kids. And space kids grow up to be contributing members of society, while dinosaur kids grow up to eat gravel and breakdance on crowded New York City subways. There was like a natural fascination that just about every kid had with space, and even though it manifested in different ways, it became somewhat of a communal interest that you could talk about with most people. As kids, we could come together and talk about how cool the universe was. I bet there's Martians and space lasers and star people, and then realistic Randy would be like, ooh, I bet a ton of it is super empty, and that kid later grew up to be Todd Howard and invent Starfield. But why were so many of us so enamored with space in the first place? What attracted us to the dark, endless, unknown mysteries of our universe? Well, it was just that. Space is the greatest representation of the unknown. You know when you tell a kid to do something and they ask you why, and then you answer them, and then they ask you why again, and you explain it to them, and they ask you why again, and you have to fight the urge to abandon them at a gas station in Oklahoma? They do that because we're obviously the most curious when we're younger, and so if you take something like space, which most adults don't even understand, even in the simplest of terms, that's the perfect conduit for that. It's the big unanswered question in the sky. And as we age, we get less curious, so while some people maintain their love for space into adulthood and actually become astronauts or researchers, most of us end up with just a passive interest in it, which again is why I'm here and not sipping star juice and hanging out with moonmen in my space yacht. Except, are we actually the most curious when we're younger? Turns out a lot of recent studies have actually been trying to get to the bottom of this, and the rough conclusion is that we don't actually get less curious as we age, but the way that we are curious changes. The older you get, the more domain-specific your curiosity becomes. You're no longer curious about everything, you're curious about the things that you're personally invested in and you believe would be beneficial to you. Which is why you probably don't sit around as an adult thinking, I wonder what purple tastes like, but you're still susceptible to going down a huge rabbit hole on a topic that personally interests you. We need to be convinced to be curious, which is where we can finally start talking about games. This video is about games, it's not about space, even though I've been talking about space for the last 3 minutes. Generating curiosity is important to every stage of a game. The cover needs to be interesting enough to grab your attention, the opening needs to hook you and give you characters or a gameplay loop that you'd be happy to spend the next dozen to 100 hours with, and the player constantly needs a reason to be excited for the next thing that shows up. But you remember how I just said we need to know something will benefit us before we can actually be curious about it? That's where we get this, where the game says, okay, there's something here, and something here, and something here, and something here, and I won't tell you what any of it is, but trust me, it's pretty cool, so check it out. And while a lot of people online complain about this, saying that they don't want their hand to be held, which is understandable, most of us have never had our hands held before, it's very scary, there's also a reason it's done. It defines concrete tasks, simplifies what's important, and creates this synthetic sense of paying off your curiosity. But some games have made a name for themselves by rejecting that very idea, by not always announcing what will benefit the player and which curiosity points to pursue, instead creating stories, worlds, or even universes that genuinely remain ambiguous, pushing the player to explore and experiment on their own, capturing that childlike awe that drew us to larger concepts like space, mythology, and ancient creatures, and presenting us with it again as we grow out of that natural tendency to explore broader ideas. A recent influx of games have begun to leverage ambiguity to great effect, and many of them have become pretty popular in the process. But instead of breaking down this topic idea by idea, I think it's more fun to talk about how ambiguity either targets or results in different emotional responses, and I think the best place to start is fear is an incredibly powerful tool. It's so powerful, in fact, that it's slowly been seeping into a bunch of different genres that aren't related to horror at all, but I'm not going to get into that right now. That's a whole other topic that I'll talk about some other time. The unknown is the basis of fear. Even from an evolutionary standpoint, if you don't know what something is or what it can do, there's always a chance that it could be a threat, so you have to decide between fight or flight in an instant. Even if we somehow have the assurance that that thing isn't a threat, the sheer options of what the unknown might hold ups our anxiety and engages our brains. It's why the monsters in A Quiet Place were a lot scarier in concept when you weren't as aware of what they were, what they looked like, and where they came from. As Tame Impala once said, the less you know, the spookier, which is where the granddaddy of all fears comes from, the dark. Boo. That aversion to the unknown can be used to explicit a strong reaction from the audience, and one of the easiest ways to do this is by first setting up a simple cause and effect relationship, and then start breaking that in different ways as you go, which means the player stops trusting the patterns that they picked up on earlier. So sometimes the best jump scares are the ones that never actually happen. The music swells and the lights dim and nothing. And now all of a sudden, the sound and visual cues are no longer a reliable indicator of what the game's structure is going to be. You've lost your control and understanding, and that means it's spooky time. Another common trope is not explaining why the player is where they are to begin with, and what they're even trying to do or find. Amnesia is a game where you have amnesia, and the reason you got to where you are is shrouded in pure mystery, which means not a single goddamn thing makes sense at first, and that's naturally terrifying. A lot of classic horror titles do this, most notably Silent Hill, which slowly unveils the reasons you're here as the game goes on, but as the full picture gets clearer, it becomes apparent that the answer is more dark and sinister than you could have ever imagined, solidifying your reason for being fearful even as the fog around the narrative is slowly lifted. Games like Little Nightmares, Limbo, and Inside go even further into this idea, if anything becoming more confusing as they go, or at the very least distracting you from your desire to find answers by introducing new threats constantly. They don't even give you a second to catch your breath and understand where you are, how this world developed into what it is, why you're being hunted, where you're trying to go, and unlike a typical story structure, these games actually introduce even more questions as they progress, while answering very little and then ending in places that leave you even more confused than ever. Inside isn't a standard horror game with jump scares and crazy killers and a string of monsters and mysteries that you're solving, but it's a masterclass in using ambiguity to instill an uneasiness in the player. It starts you at a point where you have nothing but questions, and it ends in an even more uncertain place, imbuing imagery into the audience's mind that lasts long past the end credits because you're still trying to decipher what they mean. One of my favorite minor horror tropes is actually increasing the uncertainty in something by showing it more rather than keeping it shrouded. Essentially taking something that doesn't seem important and constantly making references to it to the point where the player goes, is this important? I feel like you keep mentioning this. There's gotta be something here, right? By drawing so much attention to something small like that, you can either slowly and naturally unravel truth behind a mystery, or build a greater sense of uncertainty in the player, causing them to overthink offhand or mundane things. One of my favorite examples of this is in Alan Wake 2, and while I'm not gonna get into any major spoilers here, I am gonna be talking about a theory about part of the mystery I had when playing this game, without also divulging the outcomes, so if you haven't played it and you want to go in completely blind, you can skip to this timestamp. Alan Wake 2 almost drove me insane thinking about coffee. Unlike some of the other horror games that I've mentioned here, Alan Wake 2 doesn't leave you fully in the dark about your role in the story. You play as two characters, and it's made instantly clear why both are here and what the general situation they're in is. But that doesn't mean there's a lack of mysteries involved. In fact, there are a metric buttload, and you're in the dark about most of them. Slowly but surely, you start to piece together important parts of the puzzle, and at the same time you develop your own theories, which may or may not end up being true. And for me, one of the things that was driving me insane was how much coffee there was in this game. There's an advertisement for a local coffee shop early in the game. The police precinct has the same brand of coffee on officers' desks, and entering the precinct is also where you start noticing weird things in town. There are lingering shots of the detectives drinking coffee while looking at the evidence board. The save point is a coffee cup. The diner, which serves the coffee, is an important early location. There's a coffee-themed amusement park, for God's sake. Coffee is everywhere. There's too much coffee, enough that at some point I was just thinking, there's gotta be something with this coffee, right? When has there ever been this much coffee anywhere? So every time I saw a coffee cup, I'd look around. Every time I read the word coffee in a letter, I'd reread it for clues. Every time I went to a real-life coffee shop, I'd have my brother take a sip first to see if it was poisoned. I became obsessed with coffee-related conspiracies. And whether that hunch actually led to something or not doesn't actually matter. The point is that this game made me nervous and weary about a goddamn drink, because I wasn't sure if I was overthinking things or if the leader of the cult was like Tim Horton. Bloodborne has a really interesting approach to horror. It actually turns fear into a direct mechanic. Basically, the more just like bonkers stuff you see, the more insight you gain, and the more things that were always hidden in the world become visible to you, including the amygdala, which is literally the name of the part of your brain that experiences fear. And that means that much like Silent Hill, the veil around the game being lifted actually increases your fear instead of easing your mind. This stuff was there the whole time. It could even interact with you at some points. You've just now become insane enough to be able to see it. A lot of the games mentioned here leave on an open-ended note, sometimes rewarding your efforts with strange, grotesque, horrific closing acts for our characters and leaving you wondering how the curse or cycle will ever come to an end. Allowing the final moments of a story to hang like this can be a really efficient way to keep the player thinking long after the game rolls credits, with the same logic extending to things like audio logs or environmental details that leave just enough room in your imagination to make a character's fate as grim or marginally hopeful as you choose to have. And while these games or sections might not give you the satisfying, conclusive ending that you were hoping for, they don't intend to. What they instead intend to make you do is... You guys ever heard of a weenie? Not like this part of your elbow, that's a weenus. I'm talking about weenies, like of the Hut Jr. persuasion. A weenie is a term for a visual icon or a focal point, usually a large structure or something with striking colors that makes you go, oh, that thing's probably important. Basic visual language is a huge part of games even when the UI elements, dialogue, and the icons are super overabundant, and things like weenies are really important to that because they kickstart your curiosity without a character necessarily needing to say, hey, you should go to that place, it looks like there might be something over there. But you can apply the same logic to basically any object. It doesn't have to be a giant focal point. I remember in the Elden Ring DLC I saw this tiny little ghost rock thing with wind around it, and there was no explanation on what to do with it, but it was clearly something important, so I put down a marker. Then a few hours later, I found a rock formation with little wisps that was actually interactable, so I broke it and it said, a seal has opened. And I was like, oh, okay, it's gotta be the thing that I saw before, that's open now. And so I visited the ghost rocks that I had marked before, and they were still there. No change at all, so I was like, I guess there are multiple pairings of these seals? But how am I supposed to know which of these locks links to which key? I couldn't really figure it out, so I was like, I'll deal with this some other time. And then a few hours later, I saw another ghost rock and another rock formation, this time right next to each other, and breaking these rocks opened the ghost rock seal next to it. And I was like, oh, the locks and keys are probably all close together. I just need to explore more thoroughly in those previous areas. And sure enough, I quickly found the seals and spirit jumps in the last two locations I was in, and thought, nice, now I know what to do if these things ever show up again. The only information that the game thought was necessary for me to know was that breaking these rocks opened a seal of some kind. Everything else I was able to piece together myself, and this is a really good way to be ambiguous, but also kind of obvious. Not only did the way the seal looked catch my attention, immediately alerting me to the fact that this was something that you had to be able to interact with or unlock at some point, but the lock and the key also fit together aesthetically, one being a big pile of ghost rocks and another being a big pile of real rocks, which is how I knew these were specifically connected. If instead the seal still looked like this and the way to unlock it was like a big red button, I would not have been able to make this connection even with this message. But instead the game was able to tell me how this mechanic worked without explaining any of it. That's great for open world exploration because it shows a clear connection, and your intention here is to engage the player in interacting with things around the world, but not necessarily confusing them while doing so. If you're dealing with a narrative mystery, on the other hand, the balance of ambiguity and information to make the player wonder needs to be handled with even deadlier precision. Because generating curiosity with vague details is great until you end up with genuine confusion or things that don't actually make sense together for the sake of just a shocking twist. I think a lot of mystery games are actually overly ambiguous. They don't find the correct balance, and if they do give you direct information, it's almost always meant to trick you somehow. In my opinion, a better tactic is to create open-ended questions that have multiple answers and genuinely let the player's mind shoot out in different directions, but also find a way to represent and organize that effectively so they feel like solving the mystery is more than just a crack shot. They can actually develop plausible theories. Going back to Alan Wake 2, I think the inclusion of the evidence board was so key to this game's success. The board has actually been lightly criticized for how linear it is. People say that it's less of an open space to help solve cases and more just putting things in their one allotted space. The player has no real agency, but I actually think that's exactly what it needed to be. Alan Wake 2 is a game where everything you see or experience is weird and raises an eyebrow, and a lot of its mystery mysteries might be connected, but you're not quite sure what's its own isolated story, what's linked to Alan's story, and what's linked to the cult. So, when a character acts strange at a diner, you know something's up, but you don't know what it's in relation to. So all the evidence board does is just allow you to sort through that mountain of information, and that way you can always have every piece of evidence that you've run across. And even when you finish a sub-board and it gives you a small blurb about what this all means and how it connects, it doesn't automatically stop this mystery from connecting to other ideas. It just kind of helps you sort through the things the game is introducing in a clear fashion. The board isn't there for mystery solving purposes, and I think if it was and everything was left totally up to you to solve, it would get way too complicated and hard to track. Instead, it's just a straightforward organizational tool which allows your mind to do the fun part of running wild with theories without giving you an overload of information to deal with. Basically, it leaves you all the wondering, theorizing, and mystery solving without giving you a bunch of clerical work to do alongside that. Games like Dear Esther and What Remains of Edith Finch are experiences that rely so heavily on the mystery, only for the reveals at the end to matter very little in comparison to everything else you did. It's more of a stylistic choice that engages your brain in the vague narrative until you reach the end. You're so caught up in wondering what's going on that just asking those questions is the crux of those experiences. And no game encapsulates that focus on journey over destination more than Journey, a beautifully rendered exploration of a vast desert devoid of language and guided by emotion. You go to places purely because you can and are curious what they might hold, not because anyone told you that's the next point of interest. And despite having non-humanoid characters and no dialogue or descriptions, it manages to tell a deeply human story. A story about genuine connection that comes about when you start to meet other wordless travelers on your journey. You don't know what they're thinking or saying behind their screen, all you know is that somehow, beyond all odds, you manage to find each other. Journey is a game that insists you don't think, you feel, and what you're meant to feel is something I've been thinking about a lot recently is how a game like Elden Ring can sell so many millions of copies and become such a cultural moment and still have a fan base that treats it like their little secret. There's an online community around this game that feels different to other popular games like The Last of Us or GTA, and I do think in part that's because the Souls series had a slower rise to stardom. It did start off as much more of a niche product, but I also think the abstract story, formless open world, strange lore, and the practical requirement to subscribe to VaatiVidya to understand what's even going on also impacts how this community operates. When art has clear vision and an understandable intention, its themes and meaning more explicitly communicated, everyone can experience it in roughly the same way. Your personal experiences can obviously enhance certain aspects of that art, and some things will speak to people in ways that other things just won't. But everyone is guided roughly down a similar path. You may not understand why people feel the way they do about something, but at least you know what they're reacting to. On the other hand, abstract art naturally encourages the viewer to fill in the gaps with their own interpretation, asking them to do the heavy lifting and project their emotional responses onto the piece. Unlike figurative art, which, while fully capable of manipulating and directing the viewer's emotions, can often feel like it's somebody else's vision, abstract art feels like it's truly yours because you're the one who completes it. This gives it the ability to potentially be more personal and intimate, but it also runs the risk of the viewer seeing nothing but random shapes and colors if they don't feel connected enough to project anything onto it. Which is why you maybe don't get The Outer Wilds, a game that's very self-directed and relies on your personal drive to explore and piece things together, one that's only as good as your willingness to trust it, but it's also why The Outer Wilds has one of the strongest fan bases I've ever seen for an indie game, because it rewards you more the more time and personal investment you decide to give it, generating that same wonder we just talked about. The fan base for this game is so interesting because they basically collectively agreed to be as vague as possible about why they like the game, because exploring it yourself is essential to the experience. And the game's been out for like years now, and it's because the path you take, the way you decide to piece things together, the personal revelations you have, and the sense of true freedom you feel make this an experience that's actually personal to everyone, special to everyone, different for everyone, and in a more organic way than just branching dialogue paths or different playstyles for your character. And because I know some of you are gonna ask, yes, I have finally started playing The Outer Wilds. I'm still roughly in the early sections of the game, so don't spoil too much, but I know some of you go crazy for that game, so you can stop bothering me about it now. Some of the strongest indie communities are around games like this, Hollow Knight, and Undertale, games that relish in only giving you subtle direction and story and then leaving the rest to you. And even when games like Elden Ring and the Switch Zelda duology become some of the most popular titles of all time, they still feel like personal experiences. Because there are secrets and story beats that are so hidden away that if you're truly dedicated enough to find them yourself, you actually are in a very rare and small subset of people. Millions of people have played Hollow Knight, but you can play through all of it without knowing there's even a real narrative going on. It's just a series of small, discrete interactions between funny bugs, between nail-blasting creatures and bosses. But then you could go online and see people discussing the tragic stories of different characters that were conveyed almost entirely through the environment, short dialogue exchanges, and repeat appearances where something small might have changed. Games with less direct narratives are more prone to fan theories and active discussion that lasts much longer than the average life cycle of media, which is great, but a byproduct of all of that can be a natural urge to go online right after you watch an ambiguous ending and watch dozens of ending explained videos. And you might be expecting me to criticize that. After all, the game's intention was to leave breadcrumbs around for you to piece together and come up with your own interpretation, and then you just go online and take somebody else's interpretation for your own. Isn't that just ruining the entire point of the game? But I actually feel like this reaction, while initially seeming antithetical to the whole entire structure of the games, is actually what gives them such strong fan bases. Half the appeal of these narratives is that you can talk to people about their observations and interpretations and see if it matches what you took away from it, or if they noticed a bunch of stuff that you never saw in the first place. I mean, hell, Inception's ending is still talked about today because as much as people try to get to the bottom of what makes logical sense when you look at how the rules of this movie have been set up, ultimately the answer comes down to what you want the ending to be, what feels right to you, which means that Inception can be two completely different movies with different overall themes to two different people off of one scene alone. So adopting theories and piecing things together through online discourse rather than coming up with answers on your own is a perfectly valid way to consume this content to me. It doesn't undercut the intentions of the game, it actually makes our love for them even stronger. Our connection to ambiguous stories and unorthodox game structures comes from their ability to feel like they're our own creation in some small way, but the difficulty is that for this to succeed, there needs to be a level of trust between the player and the game. You need to trust that the game will actually pay off your curiosity, and the game needs to trust that you won't just leave the second you realize that you have to use more than 3% of your brain power. And if either of these sides lose that trust in each other, it can lead to whether we're talking about sports, art, work, school, or even just day-to-day activities, there's a natural concept of flow. Being able to do things in a seamless, almost trance-like state, effortlessly gliding through obstacles and straight up vibing, having a chill-ass time. I mean, me personally, I hit my flow state when I crack open a brewski with the boys, am I right, fellas? That is Kool-Aid. Flow is more than just a feeling, though. It's a psychological concept that's been thoroughly studied, and specifically, there was one dude, whose name I'm not even gonna try to pronounce, that listed what he dubbed the 7 characteristics of flow, essentially a brief description of the mental state in which a person is fully immersed in an activity. And those were having clear goals, concentrating on the task at hand, experiencing a loss of self-consciousness, receiving direct and immediate feedback, finding a balance between challenge and skill, having a sense of control, and feeling a distorted sense of time. Things just felt like they were moving slower or faster while in flow. Because these are universal signifiers of somebody experiencing a flow state and they're not native to any particular activity, they also apply to how designers create games. There are tactics and approaches that, when executed effectively, can lead to each of these results. Now, a few of these can be targeted with both ambiguous and unambiguous games, and some are actually easier to achieve with games that aren't overly structured. But specifically, having clear goals and receiving immediate and direct feedback are things that you're just not gonna get in a game like The Outer Wilds, which could have an effect on the player's ability to feel the flow that's crucial for this experience to work. Obviously, there's some intrinsic motivation here. Some players aren't looking for direct rewards because they find the exploration naturally enjoyable, the soft sounds, the strange characters, but the game is directionless by nature, and if players don't know why they're doing what they're doing, and they don't have complete faith that their blind exploration will lead to something worthwhile in the end, they won't give it a real shot. I mean, I'll be honest and say the only reason I'm playing through this game is because of the overwhelming amount of people who have told me either directly or indirectly that I will be rewarded tenfold for my efforts. But in a world where I wasn't given that guarantee, I don't know if I'd be able to find it within myself to just sink that much time into a game not knowing if it was gonna lead anywhere in the end. I would start to get frustrated or bored, and if I ever got stuck for even a slightly extended period of time, that might mean the end of my time with the game. Not to mention, getting stuck like that is way likelier to happen in the first place when the structure is so open. The player is being asked to think non-linearly, and so for the devs, anticipating whether the breadcrumbs you've left for them will be enough becomes a nearly impossible task. This really plagues the Souls games a lot. The majority of players will find out how to get to hidden locations and side quest points of interest through wikis and other external sources that undermine the ambiguity the game presents. There just aren't enough solid hints for most people to be able to piece things together, so eventually it just makes you throw your hands up and say, look man, I just want to fight the giant snake guy that everyone keeps talking about. Can somebody please just tell me how I can do that? Are you goddamn kidding me? Series creator Hidetaka Miyazaki himself has said of players going in blind, if they can't do it, then there's some room for improvement on our behalf, acknowledging that some of this stuff is just way too obtuse. And the only way most people can avoid the potential frustration associated with this design is by going to external sources that say, hey man, you actually have to delete your save file and input the hexadecimal code for each pixel of this image of Mike Wazowski from Monsters Inc. into your Popeyes DoorDash order to unlock the ability to play Wii Tennis with Radon on a giant plasma screen TV in Caelid. This was all explained by a single hieroglyphic on a cave wall in the game Road Trip Adventure for the PS2. I'm not sure how you missed that, but I guess these games aren't for everyone, only real gamers like me. Some of the things the player is expected to infer are straight up goofy. It continuously shocks me how some of the stuff is found in the first place. But at least with the Souls games, people do in fact tell you what the solution to a vague puzzle is, even if they can be a little bit snobby about it. In some other games' cases, people's dedication to preserving the game's mysterious quality within the fandom can actually increase the frustration. Tunic is a game with a lot of hidden secrets, and even its in-game manual, which gives you little tips, is written in a fake language, meaning players have to use context, images, and their own interpretation of what a page could mean to fully understand what things do or where to go next. That, or you could just explore freely without trying to understand the manual. And I remember seeing a forum from a while back where somebody asked a vague question about a mechanic, I don't really remember which, and they received a vague answer with a slightly less vague hint, but no clear-cut instructions. And this is pretty standard for discussions around this game, because people don't want to outright give things away, since that's part of the fun. But in this instance, the poster got mad and said, hey man, I didn't come here to ask for a direct answer to this vague puzzle just to get more vague instructions. Tell me what to do. I'm already on Reddit. What are you trying to preserve? And that's always the risk you run with ambiguity, especially if your fan base continues it. Not understanding something after that long of looking at it can make you feel upset, discouraged, and honestly, kinda stupid. And if you have to break from the game to go somewhere else to figure it out, it feels unnatural. And this might be the part where you're thinking, well, that just means that these games aren't for these people. Not every game has to be for everybody. If you don't want to play an ambiguous game, don't play an ambiguous game. It's that simple. But I can't tell you how many times I felt happy and rewarded playing through a section of a Souls game that I definitely would have slammed my head against the wall trying to find if I didn't have a guide. And yeah, sometimes I want to know what to do next in Tunic because for whatever reason my brain isn't connecting the dots. I just want to move on, and the best way to do that is by throwing in the towel. I like these games and their structures, but sometimes I do feel like their looser grip makes the difficulty curve of discovery completely implode. And I don't think it's always a criticizable reaction if a player can't pick up on certain vague directions. Again, they have no way of knowing how long this discovery will take, whether they'll be able to figure it out at all, and even if they do, whether it's something that's worth their time, so they might as well just get the answer straight up instead of wasting a whole play session trying to decipher cryptic code. To be very clear, I am not saying these games shouldn't be ambiguous because that can be frustrating. Obviously, I like these games. This whole video is about their importance. But it is worth looking at both the positive and negative effects of the decision to obscure information from the player. Is it better to give as little information as possible and deal with the consequence of some players getting soft-locked and needing to break their immersion to continue? Or is it better to make things way more obvious and deal with the consequence of some players feeling like there's no sense of discovery? I'd argue neither, and just because the games being discussed here are considered by some to be higher forms of art than, like, I don't know, Assassin's Creed, doesn't mean they're objectively better in every way. I love Metroidvanias, but Nine Souls has kinda gotten on my nerves repeatedly because I feel like the game isn't even giving me hints of where to go next. Especially if I put it down for a day or two, I come back and have no clue what's happening. And then I feel like I have to either spend a bunch of time looking at points on the map I haven't explored which might constantly lead to dead ends, or I have to look at a walkthrough to get an idea of which direction to head, which is really frustrating and immersion breaking. A lot of modern Metroidvanias have given players the option to mark different roadblocks with a different set of icons, which is a nice way to mitigate this problem because if you organize it correctly, you might know which of these locations might now be accessible with your newly acquired knowledge or abilities, but sometimes it feels like you still end up spending hours backtracking through previously explored sections, desperately trying to figure out what ahead actually is, and if you don't get much time to play in general, that can be an even bigger nuisance. Flow isn't necessarily impossible to achieve with more ambiguous storytelling or structure, because you could even argue that a certain amount of frustration, if it's contained and alleviated soon after, is actually part of achieving the level of challenge that you need to achieve flow state. But that becomes an extremely delicate balancing act. It's just much easier to meet this criteria if you clearly reveal information to the player. One of the best recent examples of a game that remains in constant flow is the new Astrobot. In maybe 1 or 2 brief moments in the 20 hours I took to fully complete all of this game's content, did I not feel like I was moving forward at an exceptionally swift pace. And it did that by being as low impedance as possible. It tells you explicitly how to perform every action in the game and how to chain things together to solve puzzles. It leaves nothing to the imagination. By the way, if you want to hear a little bit more about Astrobot, you should check out this video that I put out on my second channel. Wink wink. So maybe with this idea specifically, it really doesn't do a game a ton of favors to hide its hand. That might be capping the amount of players that are able to engage with it in the way that it's intended compared to more straightforward experiences. But the trade-off is if you can meet the challenge, if you can decipher a complicated puzzle or piece together small environmental details to create a story, it leads to a strong, genuine sense of there may be like 3 people in the history of the universe who have managed to solve every puzzle in The Witness without guides probably feel like a god. I'm not gonna lie to you and pretend like I'm some kind of puzzling genius. I'm not. But nothing beats the feeling of solving a difficult puzzle on your own, staring straight into the 4th dimension, stopping time, and achieving nirvana to figure out how to get your worm in a hole in Can of Wormholes. Just like the emotional core of abstract art feels like it's really, truly yours, the thrill of making a connection between 2 lore items you received 40 hours apart feels really truly yours. I've played a ton of games and gotten a ton of platinum trophies, some of which I've gone through heaven and earth and the chalice dungeons to finally earn, but so many of them I needed guides or in-game hints to finish. I wouldn't say I felt proud when I got a platinum trophy, more satisfied, but finding an unusual solution to a puzzle in Tears of the Kingdom on the other hand feels earned. The risk-reward proposition of these games is that if you fail to understand them, you feel stupid and discouraged, but if you finally figure it out, it's a genuine achievement. And yet, those things aren't exactly opposite, they're deeply entangled with one another. Only by achieving a level of cognitive dissonance and making the player feel discomfort around their own lack of knowledge can they feel genuine victory when they overcome that. In fact, all of the emotional responses that we've talked about are only as strong as their weakest link. Love comes from the personal ownership and sense of pride that comes with imprinting your mind, body, and soul onto these rigid guidelines. Pride requires the threat of frustration, which you eventually overcome. Frustration is the response to endless wonder that isn't effectively balanced with a steady stream of discoveries and revelations, and wonder is born from the sheer possibility of the unknown, the unexplained expanse of the universe around us that we question, explore, doubt, and fear. I find that generally games with ambiguous narratives and structure are put on a pedestal, they're treated like the correct way to design games, whereas these endless checklists and map icons are low-effort crutches from designers who just don't have the raw talent of these other teams, but I personally don't think that's a great way of looking at it. The risk of alienating or frustrating players is a lot higher with a hands-off approach, the sheer possibilities overloading and even terrifying your audience instead of encouraging them to explore. But the upside is that it can capture the minds of millions of people and activate the most primal and pure form of curiosity that we start to lose with older age. In one of the studies that I looked at when researching this video, they mentioned that while our curiosity does fade with time, finding ways to preserve that, especially in the areas that we're interested in, is incredibly important to memory and cognitive performance. Curiosity is an essential thing we need to maintain, which is why we need to have experiences like this, although we also equally need the other kind. A lot of the times when I play a game, I'll be honest, I want upfront tasks, rewards, and a sense of direction. I play games usually to think less and act more, and if you tell me how to do that, it's a calming and easy to process experience that can help me de-stress. But other times, I just want to be curious. I want to open up my mind to a new world, one where I'll almost definitely miss important puzzle pieces or background details, but I'll learn them through a small community of people who are just as passionate and curious as I am. But even as I share my love for this piece of art with other people, my Outer Wilds, my Hollow Knight, my Elden Ring is entirely my own. And when I hit the credits, I'm left with less facts and details about what happened in the game, and instead with all the emotions I felt while playing them. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, subscribe. Go check out my second channel. It's where I do faster videos. It's gonna be somewhere on here. Join the Discord, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.